Welcome to another LEGO lore video. This time on LEGO Legends, we'll be discussing the scariest theme of them all. That's right, you clicked on this video, we're talking about LEGO Monster Fighters. Released in 2012, at least to me, this theme was the pinnacle of the one-shot wonder themes LEGO used to do. Whereas nowadays, LEGO focuses on their evergreen themes and massive sets, back in the day, LEGO would regularly produce a theme that was only intended for one or two waves. There's something magical about these one-shot themes. I feel like the creators had so much creative freedom to do whatever. With this theme, you can tell they really wanted to capture the vampire, zombie feel of a lot of the other media that was prevalent during this time, and the designers and storytellers just had a lot of fun with it. And let's dive into it with the complete story of the LEGO Monster Fighters theme. Although the life-giving light of the sun never touched the bare and bitter soil of this land, the rain beat down harder than usual as Dr. Rodney Rathbone took refuge from the weather in the worst possible place, the very castle of the ruler of this dreaded territory, Lord Vampire. Although Rathbone was out of the rain, there was no comfort nor solace in these dark halls. He was one of the few mortals that wasn't a stranger in these desolate monster lands, but even still, this was the first time he'd ever dare step foot in this unnatural structure. Rathbone was compelled by the disturbing evidence he uncovered near the haunted house that indicated the unholy vampire was once again active and beginning to meddle with the lives of mortals. He didn't know what the monster was up to or what he was looking for. He only knew that the answers lay within these halls, and with the vampire and his bride away at their haunted house, he had a better chance of finding it. With his skill, combined with a lot of luck, he was able to get into the evil creature's laboratory, finding everything he needed to know. As he looked through the Lord Vampire's notes, his stomach dropped. He realized the devastating plan this creature of the night had put together. Rathbone was a cunning fighter, even turning the loss of his leg into an advantage through robotics. He knew that this, however, was out of his depth. He couldn't fight the monsters alone this time. That despicable Lord Vampire was going to attempt the unthinkable. His plan was to blot out the sun throughout the rest of the world forever. Rathbone gathered that the Lord Vampire was on the hunt for some mysterious jewels called Moonstones. He had heard of these powerful objects before. Then he left as quickly as he could, carefully avoiding the man-bat creatures that stood guard over the castle. When Rathbone returned to his home in London, he immediately pored over the journals and documents left to him by his ancestors about the unnatural monster lands. Finally, he found something left behind by his great-great-great-grandfather, the very first mortal ever known to step foot in and return from the monster lands. His ancestor recorded 6 moonstones and their hidden locations. These jewels had indescribable power. With all 6 of them, Lord Vampire certainly could blot out the sun. However, he also could do an incredible amount of damage with only just one. The next step had to be recruiting others to the cause. Luckily, he was able to find just the crew. The first that joined up was Ann Lee. Rathbone found her in an aircraft hangar practicing a peculiar martial art form with a broomstick. She also happened to be the best pilot in the area, and had already been to the Monsterlands on her own, with scars from a witch to prove it. The next member of the team actually sought Rathbone out. Major Quentin Steele, an older man obsessed with the hunt. He heard that Rathbone could direct him to some exotic prey. Next, when he met Jack McHammer, Rathbone knew that this giant of a man would be the perfect foil to those zombie hordes of the Monsterlands. McHammer also had his own vendetta against one of the only humans living comfortably in the Monsterlands, the crazy scientist. And Rathbone had a feeling they would run into him on this quest. The newly formed team were just about to embark when they discovered the last member, a young man named Frank Rock. What he lacked in skill, he more than made up for with his determination. Frank was set on traveling to the Monsterlands to take revenge on the swamp creature, who he had claimed stole his dog. The leader of this group protested at first, but ultimately relented in Rock joining them. If he were to go off into the Monsterlands anyway, it would be best for him to come with them rather than alone, and so the monster fighters set off into the dreaded lands. Since Frank Rock was so impatient to find the swamp creature, Rathbone decided they would search in Cold Sleep Swamp for the first Moonstone. The swamps were hard to travel, and at the first sign of the swamp creature, Frank rushed to attack. Due to his rash actions, Frank was separated from the others in the unfamiliar territory with the fierce creature. The young man had lost the monster, but not for long. The thing had appeared from nowhere, attacking the inexperienced monster fighter with a crude spear. Luckily for Frank, the monster didn't stab him, and only bludgeoned him with it. However, the creature brought a spear to a gunfight. As Frank pulled himself from the muck, he also pulled his revolver on the thing, shooting. In his excitement, he unloaded it at the monster, not landing a single hit. However, the swamp creature had been scared off for now, and it was enough of a signal to the other monster fighters that they soon found him. While Rathbone was scolding the young monster fighter, it was discovered. The light green Moonstone was found in the muck. It seems that the swamp creature had dropped it in his escape. Although they were closer to their goal, Rathbone's fears were confirmed. They were running out of time. The Lord Vampire had sent the swamp creature to find the Moonstone, and surely more monsters would be on the hunt for the other incredible jewels. They couldn't risk the vampire getting his hands on a single Moonstone. And so, against Rathbone's better judgment, they decided to split up in the monster lands. Anne and Frank would go to the Badlands to find the Moonstone guarded by the cursed mummy. Steele insisted on going alone into Dratchwald Forest for the finest hunt of his life, and McHammer would join Rathbone himself to delve into the voodoo doctor's territory. Truth be told, Frank wasn't incredibly useful during the encounter with the mummy. The monster's chariot moved like lightning across the dark, barren desert. Anne's only chance of catching it was to fly as fast as her craft could carry her near it. After the chariot was spotted, she flew high to avoid the dust kicked up by the animated skeletal horse, pulling the ancient evil across the sand. She moved her craft closer to the cursed horror. She did her best not to pay any attention to the flames bellowing from where the eyes of the undead horse should have been. As quickly as she could, she lined up a shot with her trusty crossbow and broke the wheel of the chariot. The undead horse kept running as the chariot rolled and smashed apart, and quickly landed and ran over to the wreckage. Before she could see anything of note, a wrapped hand emerged, and the mummy rose from his destroyed transport. He raised a blackened and curved blade to the monster hunter. Luckily, Anne brought her broomstick, and with moves the mummy had never seen in his undead life before, began beating the wrapped monster into submission. But in the end, there was no contest. He was just too slow. In the wreckage, Anne found the purple Moonstone and made her way back to Frank. Before those two even made it to the Badlands, Major Quentin Steele had his encounter with his incredibly dangerous prey. He was driving through the forest looking for a good place for an ambush when he himself was ambushed. Claws longer and sharper than any he had ever encountered before ripped through the metal in a flash. He swerved and skidded to a stop as the headlights illuminated the subject of an unimaginable curse. The werewolf stood snarling, looking the hunter in the eye. As Rathbone had warned, this disturbing monster was commanded by Lord Vampire to find the orange Moonstone hidden within the forest. The werewolf wasted no time in attacking the grizzled hunter. However, Steele had an enhanced eye that watched every movement of this thing as he pulled up his hunting rifle and shot the thing that came barreling towards him. The werewolf was stopped in its tracks. Rathbone had given Steele the secret weakness of this creature: rounds of silver bullets. The Major had taken down the greatest beast imaginable, and once more the werewolf had just uncovered the Moonstone hidden in the knot of a nearby tree. Meanwhile, Rathbone and McHammer were having a heck of a time with the zombies that roamed the graveyard within the realm of the voodoo doctor. As Rathbone had imagined, his companion's larger size, hammer, and robot arm were incredibly useful against the horde of undead. They fought through mindless creatures, making their way to where the voodoo doctor had hidden this jewel. For the most part, Rathbone could keep the zombies at bay with his sword skills. However, the zombie bride had gotten a bite on him. Luckily, it was only on his robotic leg. McHammer dispatched this putrefied maiden with his hammer, and as her groom attacked, Rathbone laid eyes on the pink Moonstone and seized the opportunity to grab it. However, while he did so, the zombie groom had left McHammer in quite a state. It seems he wasn't all too happy to have his bride dispatched. It was all Rathbone could do to take care of the zombie and get his friend out of the diseased graveyard. They barely got away with their lives and soon met up with the Major. Rathbone knew he should have waited for the return of Anne and Frank, as well as McHammer, to get back on his feet. However, every moment they waited to claim the Moonstone from the crazy scientist gnawed at him. For each moment was another moment Lord Vampire could simply order the scientist to hand it over. So in haste, he and Steele moved quickly into the laboratory of this crazed experimenter, leaving McHammer behind to get some much-needed rest, and to tell Anne and Frank what had happened when they returned. Inside the lab, they weren't sure what to expect. Rathbone had come across the unnatural creations of the scientist before. He knew that there was no telling what abominations the scientist would have created most recently. They would find out soon enough, though, as they startled a huge, lumbering monster made up of other figures' parts. The creature lashed out in fear at the two monster fighters, getting the attention of the crazy scientist. He laughed as his monster began knocking them around. Quentin's bullets and Rathbone's sword seemed to have no effect on this abomination. Rathbone pointed out the Moonstone attached to a huge machine completely out in the open. He would distract the monster as Steel made his way to the shimmering dark green Moonstone. The crazy scientist stood in protest, but still quickly knocked him down, crashing into jars of frogs and other caged creatures, then took the Moonstone. Rathbone ordered him to run with it, while the monster lifted the leader into the air. The Major knew it was more important to keep the jewel safe, and reluctantly left his friend behind. He quickly went back to Jack McHammer and told him of what had happened. He would hope that Anne and Frank would be back by then, but there was no sign of them. McHammer stood, deciding he felt well enough to go help Rathbone. Steel stayed behind to guard the Moonstones. McHammer crashed into the lab, not being one for stealth. His friend was locked away in a cage, being guarded by the monster, as the crazy scientist put together his next unhinged experiment. McHammer immediately attacked the monster with his hammer. However, like the sword and rifle, it seemed to have no effect on this creature. Soon the monster had gotten the best of McHammer. The lumberjack struggled violently as he was unwilling to lose yet another limb to another hideous creature made by the crazy scientist. Rathbone yelled to him the weakness of this monster he had discovered while he was locked away. The creature had the mind and sensibilities of a child. One of the frogs that escaped earlier was close enough for Jack to grab it. He was able to distract the monster with it and get out of its grip. The scientist screamed for help from the unhearing monster as Jack replaced Rathbone with him in the cage. Soon after they got back to the Major, Ann Lee and Frank Rock soon showed up, and with the Blue Moonstone no less. They explained that on the way back from the encounter with the mummy, they had spotted the elusive ghost train raging through the moor of woe and wailing. Feeling up to the challenge, she lowered Frank down to one of the cars and began attacking the train from her airplane, acting as a distraction for the swarming ghosts. She expertly dodged their attacks and was able to withstand their ghoulish presence. Frank traveled from car to car doing his best to evade the apparitions, and soon enough he came to the mysterious Blue Moonstone. Anne moved her plane down below the train and he leapt to the wing. Then Anne kicked it into gear and put as much distance between them and the ghost as possible. Now that they had all 6 Moonstones, they could begin their journey back to their homelands. However, before they got too far, Lord Vampire's hearse was spotted ripping through the land. This creature of the night was finally returning from his haunted house visit in the mortal realm. And through the windows, Rathbone could see the mysterious and distinct glow of a Moonstone. Lord Vampire had found a red one, not marked on the monster fighter's map. There was no time to lose. The monster fighters rushed to the terrible castle of the Lord Vampire. Hopefully they could catch him off guard enough to take the Moonstone from him. Unfortunately, they didn't find him as off guard as they had hoped. In fact, they ran headfirst into a trap. His thralls of zombies and hideous bat creatures swarmed them. Soon enough they were captured, and although Lady Vampire was seemingly indifferent to their presence, the Lord Vampire thanked Rathbone profusely for collecting all the Moonstones for him. As Lord Vampire started to finish his wicked machine, Rathbone mustered all the strengths he had in his robotic leg and broke free of his bonds. He and the other monster fighters were quickly freed, and they began really living up to their namesake. Ann Lee used a clove of garlic against Lady Vampire. McHammer fought fiercely against the zombie thralls, while Frank and Still started shooting down the bat creatures. Rathbone himself drew his blade against Lord Vampire. The vampire drew his own black blade, and they began dueling throughout the castle. Lord Vampire expressed excitement at causing Rathbone to lose another limb, but that wouldn't happen this time. Rathbone was able to land a devastating blow through the heart of the monster. With Lord Vampire wounded so severely, his control over the other creatures broke and they scattered. The monster fighters reclaimed all the Moonstones, including this new red one. And soon enough, the monster fighters were safe back in London with all the Moonstones. Although Lady Vampire has been seen from time to time in her haunted house accompanied by the crazy scientist monster, nobody really knows what happened to Lord Vampire. Most believe he was killed by Rathbone that night, but others say he's still in his castle, waiting and plotting. And that was my version of the Monster Hunter's story. And now we'll transition to looking at the characters of monster fighters, starting of course with the monsters. Lord Vampire was used in the video game Lego 2K Drive as Baron Von Rose, so that's possibly his actual name. He was also used as Count Dracula in the Lego Batman movie. Also, let's not confuse him with Vampire Lord from Heroica. These are 2 distinct characters. He rules the distant monster lands from his castle. One of my favorite parts of the story that I really couldn't figure out how to put in my retelling of the story because I really wanted it to focus on the monster fighter point of view is that this whole thing started because his wife expressed a desire for a specific jewel called a Moonstone. and she hounded him for quite some time. When he relented and went searching for the jewel, he found it and then decided to keep it for himself because it had magical properties. I think that's really funny and a really fun detail to put in the story. And then, as he unlocked the power within, he discovered that there were other Moonstones as well. He ultimately built this machine to put on top of his tower to harness the Moonstone's power and blot out the sun forever. So then he and the other monsters would no longer be confined to the monster lands and he could take over the whole world. As a side note, this kind of blot out the sun idea happens quite a bit in media with vampires. And I think it's a really illogical, stupid thing to do. Because on one hand, if you're a vampire, yes, you're getting rid of your major weakness. However, this would be devastating for the planet. And you might be on top of the food chain, but everything would collapse. Everything would just die. And then you would be there alone at the end, with no people or anything to feed on because you're a vampire. Anyway, as the ruler of the monster lands, he commands the other monsters, mostly the swamp creature, the werewolf, and the monster with the mad scientist and the zombies. However, it seems like he doesn't have a lot of control over some monsters like the mummy or the ghosts. He does have a particular control over many of the zombie thralls and bat creatures, in which their wills seem to be completely eclipsed by his own, although they do seem to have a little tiny bit of willpower left in the story. Overall, he's a classic villain. They made him just a lot of fun, and he's a really good head villain for the theme. Next up, we have the Vampire's Bride, or Lady Vampire. And she's a master of potions and witchcraft. She also puts up with a lot from her husband and his maniacal schemes. There's not a ton of information on her, just that she's neglected by her husband, and she also has incredibly powerful magic that she honestly doesn't really seem to use to help her husband. She seems very annoyed by the whole thing. So yeah, she'll defend her home and she'll fight the monster fighters, but it doesn't look like she's super actively helping her husband in his strange fixation on the Moonstones. She's upset with him for keeping the Moonstone he got for her. She's honestly one of my favorite characters of this theme because she's just so passive. She's there and she's a threat and everything, but she's not super involved with what's going on. Her will hasn't been controlled by the Lord Vampire. She's just annoyed with him and putting up with him right now, and I think that's great. Then we also have man-bats, or bat creatures. And again, don't confuse these creatures of the night with the Batman villain of the same name, although they're extremely similar, and they actually use the same pieces. In the castle set they come with, there are only 2, although we don't know how many Lord Vampire actually has at his command. It's also unclear as to how exactly these creatures came to be. My best guess is they were actually created by the crazy scientist. They don't seem to be people that became vampire bats supernaturally, just some other kind of creation. I really doubt that they have much to do with how Lord Vampire and Lady Vampire became creatures of the night. We do get our best piece of information on them from the CMF Series 8 Vampire Bat. His bio connects him directly with the Monster Fighters theme that he was released with alongside in 2012. He is directly identified as Lord Vampire's chief henchbat. However, he's not thrilled about his master's plan to blot out the sun and secretly hopes that the monster fighters win. He actually enjoys sunny days at the beach, which is why I say they likely didn't turn into monsters the same way as Lord Vampire, because this bio directly states that these creatures can be in broad daylight with no negative effects. Again, this makes them probably not very supernatural and more of an experimentation, whether that be through Lord Vampire or the crazy scientist, although I think it's more likely to be the crazy scientist who made them. This bio also shows that the creatures that the Lord Vampire has the most control over still have a little bit of their own will and wants and desires. It's just suppressed by the Dark Master. Speaking of which, the other most loyal monsters are the zombies. They are 100% the most committed thralls the vampire has, although they too have the tiniest shreds of their own agency left. But it is pretty clear that their weakened minds make them an easier target to control. The pink Moonstone, which was hidden in the graveyard in the Monster Lands, was used by the Voodoo Doctor to bring these things back to the land of the living, giving them their corrupted life force. The most prominent zombie of the theme is the zombie driver. Although the driver is arguably the most loyal creature in the service of his master and would do absolutely anything for the vampire family, Rathbone indicates that he can be bribed with gold stars, again hinting at some agency left within him. Although it's unclear how much this actually applies, as Rathbone's journal makes him out to be more of a petty suck-up than an actual monster. The zombie butler, or monster butler, and zombie chef are other servants of the Lord Vampire. Although the zombie butler really wants to do a good job, he is rather clumsy faculty and has served as a butler in other haunted houses, although he was fired from those positions. He seems to live at the haunted house with the zombie chef, who also serves the vampire family diligently. The haunted house is referred more to as a vacation home for the vampires, as well as a base for the monsters in the far-off human lands. Next up, we have the zombie bride and groom. There's not a ton of information on them. However, they are likely the only zombies we get as figures that are not necessarily under the direct control of Lord Vampire. That doesn't make them any less terrifying, though. If anything, it makes their focus on eating a minifigure's bricks that much stronger. The main thing we know about them is their undying love, which is so strong that death could not break it, nor could being brought back to a new, depraved form of life. Now, lumped in with these figures is the Voodoo Doctor. The Voodoo Doctor was never actually made into a minifigure, and in fact was never even shown or depicted anywhere. However, it's directly stated that he is the secluded practitioner of black magic that cast a dark spell over the zombies with the pink Moonstone, which brought them all back to life. They are referred to as his creations, and under his control completely. It's also implied that he has a strong alliance with Lord Vampire, although it's unclear if the relationship is more coerced or more consensual. Also, this would technically be the 7th Moonstone, although it's stated that the Lord Vampire is only after 6. I believe that he's actively overlooking this one because it's more valuable to him in the Voodoo Doctor's hands, as he can create thralls for him. Now moving on to the ghosts, my guess is that they are people that died in the monster lands. It's stated that they're everywhere, and there's a large concentration of them, particularly in the Moor of Woe and Wailing. In this portion of the land, they are cursed to ride and defend their ghost train, which is one of the coolest sets, by the way. These monsters don't seem to have any real affiliation with the Vampire Lord, and in fact, it appears that they would have defended their train and Moonstone against him as well as the monster fighters. I'm guessing that the Blue Moonstone is what allows the train to actually be a ghost train, as its stated ability is to allow the user to pass through solid objects. There are also other ghosts that appear in the theme. One such ghost is in the Lord Vampire's haunted house. Again, I don't think that this ghost has any real connection to Lord Vampire aside from being at his house. I'm pretty sure he's just kind of there. One more interesting note on them is that they are all, in fact, apparitions wearing sheets. Rathbone's journal indicates that they are wearing cotton and get their sheets from Boobash and beyond. So who knows what they actually look like underneath. Now getting into the other Universal Studio type monsters, we have the Swamp Creature. This fishman has always lived the cold sleep swamp deep within the monster lands. I assume that Lord Vampire learned of the power of the Moonstone and the Swamp Creature was commanded to look for the one hidden in the swamp. Nothing directly is stated about their relationship. I think it's likely that he's pretty well within Lord Vampire's power. He's also one of the main monsters of the theme that is based on the Universal monster movies. Obviously, he's based on the creature from the Black Lagoon, or Gillman. Also, as a side note, he does show up as a master builder in the Lego Movie and the Lego Movie 2, although I'm not sure if this version of the character in Monster Fighters has the ability to speak and think for himself, and it's just Lord Vampire pulling strings, or if this is a different version of the character and he is just a monster. Now we have the werewolf, again based on the Universal Wolfman. He lives in Dratchwald Forest, and even lives there in his human form, possibly because it's a common trope for werewolves to separate themselves from the rest of humanity when they transform. It seems that this character has taken that to the extreme. Although we never see his human form, it is indicated that he does stay in the forest constantly. As with all werewolves, he becomes a monster by the light of the moon. However, it seems that the Moonstone is the origin of his savage strength. The way I like to look at it is, although Lord Vampire has control over him, even if he knows about the Moonstone, the human side of him is keeping it from his master. Now moving on to the Mummy, he's located in the Cursed Badlands. I believe it's also possible that he's at odds with Lord Vampire. His tomb is in the Badlands, but he's a rather active mummy as he rides his chariot throughout his chunk of the monster lands, with the Moonstone prominently positioned to amplify his dark curse. I would guess that Lord Vampire had just left him alone until this point, although it's possible that he is fully within the Lord Vampire's control as well, and maybe even in the midst of transporting the Moonstone to Lord Vampire when we see him in the set. He again is based off of a Universal monster, the Mummy, which interestingly enough, the 1932 film was the very first time a mummy was really depicted as a monster. Before that point, there was a fascination with mummies, but no real connection to horror or monsters. Anyway, let's move on to the Crazy Scientist and his monster. The Crazy Scientist is obviously based on Dr. Frankenstein, and set up shop in the monster lands, building a lab there. Again, it's unclear the nature of his relationship with Lord Vampire. It's assumed that the ruler of this realm knows about the crazy human making monsters in his land. I personally believe that the Lord Vampire sees the crazy scientist as an asset. In his bio, it mentions that he has been creating strange creatures for a long time. He's even got some history with the monster fighters, as he seems to be responsible for Jack McHammer missing an arm. As I stated before, I believe this is the most likely source for the bat creatures. I think that the Lord Vampire allows him to keep working and living there in exchange for more underlings. Of course, the crazy scientist's most famous creation is simply titled The Monster, being based on Frankenstein's monster. The monster himself is a lumbering creature endowed with enormous power and strength from the dark green Moonstone. Although he is a being of intense power and capable of incredible destruction, he is very childlike and can be easily distracted by shadow puppets or cute animals. So he's a very big, scary, kind-hearted monster. And now that we've gone through all the monsters, we'll go through all the monster fighters. First off, Dr. Rodney Rathbone. Pretty much all the information we have about the story and characters comes through the lens of Rathbone's journals. He's a London-born aristocrat that's dedicated his life to the destruction of the monsters. He got his start studying the old maps left behind by his great-great-great-grandfig, who was the first, presumably human, minifigure to step foot in the Monsterlands. Rathbone's trained with a variety of weapons. His favorite is a fencing sword. He also lost a leg to monsters, my guess is something to do with Lord Vampire, and he replaced it with a stronger cybernetic one. Rathbone is the leader of the monster fighters, and it doesn't seem that the team was properly formed before Rathbone found out about the Lord Vampire's plot to blot out the sun. Although it is clear that most of the monster fighters had been fighting monsters for quite some time, or at least had run-ins with these monsters. Next we have Ann Lee, a master of martial arts, specifically broomstick jitsu, and an even better pilot. She first worked with Rathbone when she was recruited to chart a course into the Monsterlands. Although from her scars she had run in with monsters before, her specific facial scars are said to be from a witch. Presumably that's how she got into her broomstick karate, and maybe even that's where she got the broomstick from. She can also more than handle herself with her classic anti-monster crossbow, and on top of that, she can turn any household object into a deadly weapon. She's also ready to face the vampire family, as she's got some cloves of garlic and stakes tied to her waist. Next is Major Quentin Steele. As the oldest member of the group, he's the most experienced hunter. He's dedicated his life to the hunt, although it is implied he's never fought a monster before. Traveling from so far away Africa to find new, more suitable prey, he ended up in the company of Rathbone, who put him on the trail of the werewolf. He's armed with the classic 1800s hunting gear as well as some silver bullets. Again, I don't really believe that he had much conflict with any monsters before the story began, but he had spent his whole life hunting and fighting the most dangerous animals imaginable. He likely lost his eye to one of them as it's replaced with a telescoping cybernetic one. Now we have Jack McHammer, hailing from either the backwoods of Scotland or Canada. This lumberjack is a formidable force against the monsters. Not a lot of information is known about him, however, it's assumed that the run-in with a crazy scientist and some of his monsters left him without the arm. He also presumably hasn't forgiven the scientist for this mishap, and is eager to join up with Rathbone to stop the maniac with his new cybernetic arm. Rathbone also sees him as a great asset to fight other monsters as well. And lastly, we have Frank Rock. As the youngest member of the group, he paints on his own beard every morning. He's obsessed with being a cool rebel. He wears sunglasses at night and would never look back at an explosion when he walks away. He was already after revenge on the swamp creature, as he believed the ghoul took his dog. And where all the other monster fighters have nasty scars and missing limbs, it's stated that Rock only has a few bruises so far. Although he doesn't have much experience with monsters, he's a great motorcyclist and never backs down from a fight. I assume Rathbone brought him in considering his determination and vendetta over his lack of experience. As a whole, the Monster Fighter group is pretty awesome. They cover a wide variety of hero tropes from horror. Rathbone strikes me as more of a Lovecraftian protagonist, and Ann Lee is more of a classic vampire hunter type. I also really love how Quentin Steele is an older style hunter. I think that complements the Lovecraft style character of Rathbone quite well. They're a fun group of characters that are all surprisingly unique and complement each other really well. Honestly, the monsters are the real draw to the theme, but the heroes do a great job standing on their own. And before we move on too much, I do want to cover the Moonstones, because each of them have an ability, and they're just really cool pieces with some cool printing on it. The red one with the bat has the power to control minds. The blue one with the ghost has the power to phase through objects. The light green one with seaweed on it has the power to control water. The orange one with the wolf has the power of strength and speed. The purple one with the eye has the power to magnify curses. The green one with lightning has power of enormous strength. The pink one with the zombie hand reaching from the grave has the power to create corrupted life. And I think they're pretty interesting plot pieces. It's good for the heroes and villains to have something to fight over that's specific. And now moving on, in my research of this theme, I found a couple of things that showed other directions this theme could have taken. Specifically, I found this concept art from 2010 on Reddit. I couldn't track down a specific source beyond Reddit, so that in and of itself is a good reason to take this with a grain of salt. However, it seems pretty legit to me, and there is an artist name loosely attached here, although I couldn't find much of his portfolio. I also found an article from USA Today covering the release of this theme at the time. An interview with one of the designers seemed to line up pretty well with the concept art shown. First off, let's talk about the different forms of the monster hunters that we could have gotten. First off, we have the Monster Pest Control Agency / Ghost Hunters. This concept is obviously based on the Ghostbusters, and I think it could have been a really cool, interesting take. However, it apparently didn't test well with the kids at the time, so they scrapped it. Next is basically Scooby-Doo, but with a monkey. As you can see here, there's concepts for monster fighters that are clearly just the Scooby-Doo gang, just changed up enough to avoid copyright issues. There's the clever girl, the cute girl, the dude, the goofy guy with a monkey instead of a dog, and there's even a concept of a tourist van set next to them. I think this could have also been really interesting, especially since a few years later we would actually just get Scooby-Doo Legos, and Ghostbusters Legos for that matter too. So I think it would have been kind of cool to have these rip-off characters next to the official characters that LEGO would have produced years later. Although I do prefer their more original lineup that they came up with. I also think that the monsters depicted here are super interesting. The swamp creature looks pretty close to what he ended up as, but the werewolf is pretty different. Also, Lord Vampire, or Dracula as he's labeled here, and the monster labeled here as Frankenstein, look very similar to the studio's counterparts from about a decade before this. It also seems that Lord Vampire would have had human peasant thralls based on this concept art. They again seem to be based off of Igor from those studio horror sets. Seeing this makes me think this originally could have been thought of as a way to expand the studio series itself, before they ended up just basing the monsters on the Universal characters. There's also a few other monster characters here that didn't show up in the line. Medusa, I think, being a very prominent one, because we did end up getting one that looks very similar to this concept art in the CMF Series 10 lineup in 2013. I think it's also interesting that there's this spirit (evil). We've gotten similar figures to this over the years, but I think this specific figure could have been pretty awesome. Lastly, we have and did not get a ghost pirate and a ghost boat. This set would have been amazing and would have rivaled the ghost train in its coolness. I really need LEGO to make more ghost pirates and more ghost ships. Although we did get a zombie pirate in Series 14 that was likely based on the concept art here. And the new haunted house has an alternate build to create a ghost ship. But anyway, we don't always get a bunch of behind-the-scenes information. It's really cool to see some concept art and an interview for such a cool theme. Now, I usually like to go over other CMF figures in these lore videos, because LEGO usually makes a bunch of references to other themes in the lineup, and there are a myriad of figures and characters that could fit really well in this world. And I would say most, if not all of them, actually do belong in this world. However, I've already talked about the only CMF figure that directly refers to other characters and events in Monster Fighters, which is the Series 8 Vampire Bat. All the other monster figures get pretty close to mentioning the Monster Fighter stuff. Figures such as Series 9's Mr. Good and Mr. Evil appear alongside Monster Fighters in the LEGO Worlds game, and Series 4 has previous versions of the Monster and Crazy Scientist in 2011 that were updated and reused for the Monster Fighters theme. However, this video is already really long, and there's not much, if anything, that actually connects any CMF figure to this theme. So aside from this brief mention here, I'll have to talk about spooky CMF figures and LEGO Worlds another time. And now at this point, we're starting to draw this video to a close. This is where I'd usually go over my sources for where I piece together the story and the character bios. But before I do that this time, I wanted to take a moment to look at something strange I noticed while I was researching this theme. I realized that the story is strikingly similar to the 1987 movie The Monster Squad, in which Dracula compels other monsters, a mummy, the creature, a werewolf, and Frankenstein's monster, to do his bidding and searches for a gem or amulet, and a group of monster-obsessed teens stand in his way. I'm also not the only one who noticed these similarities. It looks as though it's widely accepted that this theme was heavily influenced by that movie. This surprises me for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is a little-known cult classic kind of movie. I'd be surprised if more than a handful of you watching this video had ever even heard of it. Secondly, although it has a lot of the trappings of a kid's movie, it's not exactly super family friendly. I know LEGO bends that rule quite a bit for these themes, but this film has a ton of language particularly. I mean, just watch this clip. Bleeped out, of course, because this is a family friendly channel, gosh dang it.
Give me the amulet, you...
Aside from that being one of the greatest moments in cinema history, it's also far from the only instance of a foul mouth in this movie. The Monster Squad themselves come up with some pretty colorful insults to call each other and the monsters. The heroes from this movie and the heroes from the LEGO theme are pretty different. One is a group of kids obsessed with monsters, and the other is a grizzled group of cybernetically enhanced monster hunters from a variety of backgrounds, but also obsessed with monsters. However, the stories have striking similarities. Both revolve around heroes and monsters trying to collect gems with immense power. In the Monster Squad, there's only one gem or amulet, and it's good, not evil or neutral like the Moonstones are. In the movie, once every century, the amulet has the ability to open up a portal and banish evil forces. This is also the only time the amulet is vulnerable and able to be destroyed. The movie plot is also moved forward by Van Helsing's journal, and Monster Hunters uses the journal trope as well, mostly as a presentation for the story itself, but I think it's worth pointing out. Now, the real similarities come with the monsters themselves, as well as the settings and the locations of the movie and LEGO sets. Lord Vampire is basically Dracula in the theme, and in both stories, this vampire has control over the other monsters and bends them to his will. As I stated before, we have the werewolf, the monster, the mummy, the creature, and even vampire brides. And several of the sets do seem to be loosely based on the movie. The movie starts out at Dracula's castle, and then he sets up base in an old abandoned mansion that could be described as a haunted house, and he even drives a similar looking hearse as the one we get in the Monster Fighters theme. If you haven't seen The Monster Squad, I highly recommend it. It's an incredibly fun movie. It's got a ton of 80s tropes and action mixed with classic movie monsters. The story can be kind of stupid and its tone is all over the place, but I think it adds to the charm. The most impressive thing to me is the effects are surprisingly good. They use a ton of really cool practical effects throughout the movie, and the costumes themselves are my favorite part. Anyway, that's enough talking about Monster Squad. I thought it was interesting and worth spending a little bit of time looking at the similarities. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the sources I used for this video. First off, the extra media outside the sets, like the video games, books, and videos, don't actually have a lot of contradictions in them, like something like Fantasy Era ended up having. So this will just be a quick, brief summary of where I found the information. Aside from the sets themselves, including the new 2025 Haunted House, I'm counting that one, I found most of the information for the story from a series of videos LEGO produced and put on YouTube. Most of the information put out on the theme on the website came in the form of these videos rather than stuff written out. And all of these videos come in the form of Rathbone's journal entries. The main one is called the Mood video, which does what it says and is an animation going over the general premise of the story. There are also a series of limited animation biographies that have voiceovers with notes on whatever character or monster it's about. The book is also open in these videos with some extra information not being said in the voiceover. On top of that, there's 2 official stop-motion videos that go over the monster fighters getting some of the Moonstones. These are also presented as journal entries. These videos, along with the commercials, actually make up most of the footage I used in this video. LEGO did publish some fan films from a Halloween competition as well. There's different lore and story there, but none of it's actually officially from LEGO. And as I stated before, there's a couple of books and video games that feature the Monster Hunters. From what I can tell, none of them really add to the story or anything. They just seem to be fun things to get kids excited for the theme. The Monster Fighters are also heavily featured in a LEGO Worlds DLC that brought the Monster Town to life, presumably in the Monster Lands. Here we can see Lord Vampire's castle and some other spooky stuff, but again, there's not a whole lot of extra story here that I could find, so I may talk about it more in some other Halloween video, probably lumped in with the various CMF monster figures, as it is the main source that directly connects many of the CMF figures to the monster fighters. And with that, we've about reached the end of another LEGO lore video. The Monster Fighters are such a unique and fun theme. I have always loved monsters and creatures, so I've always gravitated towards this theme. I'm also super happy to see LEGO revisit this theme with the new Haunted House set, and I'm always hopeful that they keep making more fun monster and spooky stuff. And with that all being said, thanks for taking a look at this awesome theme with me, and if you like the LEGO lore and history, stick around, because although I haven't made a ton of these kind of videos yet, this channel really started with the Fantasy Era video, and lore and history videos are the most work for me, but they're also my favorite, and the ones I'm most proud of. So if you have any recommendations on what themes deserve this level of lore deep dive, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.